Now is Yaakov Katz, Senior Fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute and former Editor-in-Chief of the Jerusalem Post. Thank you for joining us here on BBC News. Let's start with those plans to reconstruct and rebuild Gaza. As we saw there in that report by Fergal Keane, an incredibly desperate situation there. We've seen this proposal from Arab leaders, which has been quickly rejected by the White House and Israel. What do you think the White House and Israel want to see from an Arab proposal like this?
Well, I think, Catherine, when you look at the deal or the proposal that the Arab countries put together and was presented in Cairo just yesterday, it talks about the rehabilitation, the renovation, about $50-something billion that's going to be invested in rebuilding the Gaza Strip. But what it doesn't deal with, and this is the fundamental flaw, is what happens to Hamas. We've seen that Hamas is still there, this genocidal terrorist organization. We've all watched, I'm assuming with horror, at these rallies when they've been releasing the emaciated Israeli hostages, that the 24 living ones still being held in Gaza. How do we remove them from power? And that's something that the Arab proposal completely ignores.
And this is, of course, something that's also being discussed in these wider negotiations to end the war. We've seen them stall in terms of agreeing on a second phase. Israel at the moment is talking about extending the first phase. This was always going to be a tricky moment in terms of how do you end the war going forward. What do you make of the Netanyahu government's proposal to extend this first phase rather than move ahead with ending the war? Well,
the problem here at the crux of it is that if Israel were to move to the second stage of the deal, it would have to declare the war is over, would have to withdraw its forces, some of them who are still deployed in places like the border between Gaza and Egypt, where Hamas had its smuggling tunnels. Israel wants to make sure they can't reconstitute themselves. So Israel is suggesting let's do something called like a 1.5. We'll keep getting back hostages. Israel will release Palestinian prisoners. We'll keep the ceasefire in place. Hamas has rejected that. The Americans are supporting Israel's policy and its position here, but in the time being...
We heard that directly from the United States, because we haven't heard from Stephen Witkoff, who is the Trump administration's envoy in terms of the crisis there happening in the Middle East.
Right. The Americans have given their support. Witkoff is supposed to be headed to the region, is supposed to be there. He was supposed to come earlier this week, but it seems that he's holding off. This is part of a pressure tactic on Hamas, as well as the mediators, primarily the Qataris and the Egyptians, to get Hamas to come back to the table and to agree to an extension of stage one so Israel can get back the hostages. Hamas is naturally concerned that if it agrees to the situation, Israel will then resume the war. So the hostages that it holds on to is kind of its insurance card. Israel, on the other hand, says if we end the war, Hamas is still there. So what did we achieve? And we're at this conundrum, essentially, of how does Israel get back the hostages and at the same time ensure, and I think this is everyone's interest across the globe, that Hamas is not able to still be in control of the Gaza Strip.
Yaakov Katz, thank you so much for joining us here on BBC News and for sharing